Welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thank you so much for being with me today. Today, my guest is Bruce Kaphan. If you're not familiar with Bruce, Bruce is a musician who has worked on many studio projects, often as a pedal steel player. He was a member of the group American Music Club, and over the years, he's performed on records for artists like Sheryl Crow, The Black Crowes, R.E.M, John Lee Hooker, Chris Isaak, Red House Painters, Love and Rockets, and so many others. You may have even seen some of his television performances when he was working with David Byrne on his Feelings tour and when Jewel was on Saturday Night Live and MTV Unplugged. So Bruce is definitely an extremely talented musician, and he's also an extremely talented engineer as well, and we definitely get into his story inside of this interview. And I think you're going to get a lot of great information about what it takes to become a session musician and what really goes into it and how you can do it yourself. So if you've ever thought about being that person that performs on other people's records and, gets paid to do it from your own home studio, this interview is definitely going to give you a lot of insight into what goes into that. So let's just jump right into this interview. Bruce Kaphan, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. For people who might not know your background, you've had a large history in this industry doing a bunch of different things. Can you tell us that story of how you got into music and ultimately into engineering and session playing and all that stuff?
Sure. So as a kid, I think I took piano lessons very early on. Eventually ended up kind of making my way into rock bands and that kind of thing by the time I was, in middle school, basically. And my interest in recording basically evolved out of my interest in music. I wanted to be able to record the songs I was writing and the music I was playing, and I just turned out to be that guy in the band who just had a instinctual feeling for how to make it happen. Bought my first reel-to-reel tape recorder as a teenager. It was a Revox, which was actually made by Studer, which was, I found it used someplace, and it was just a 2-track, but it kind of got me hooked. I then got into 4-track analog, bought a machine with a couple of partner friends, and had a terrible little basement studio in the house I was living in. Just ridiculously awful sounding equipment. But, I kind of got my sea legs going with that, as it were, or my chops going with that semi-pro stuff. And one thing led to another. I was working in a music store, and I met a guy who had equipment that he rented to a studio in town. And he and I made a little, deal between the two of us where I could give him a smaller amount of money than the studio would charge to get in the back door and use his trade time. And as it turns out, one of the rooms in that studio had this absolutely gorgeous vintage Neve console. So I kind of got to cut my teeth finally after working in semi-pro horrible gear for a few years. I finally got to start working on real equipment with real microphones, and that kind of got me hooked. Basically, I ended up moving from that into starting to do professional work at that studio for clients and pissing off the studio owner to no end because I was selling time to my clients for cheaper than he was selling it for. And and all this while I was playing in bands, networking, finally got I was working professionally, so I was working full time as a musician, playing in various nightclub gigs and this and that. And then finally got a pretty good break in 1989 when, some guys that I knew from earlier on in my life were in a band called American Music Club. And that band was just kind of starting to take off, and we got some amazing press, and eventually Rolling Stone picked an album that I helped engineer and produce as one of the best five, critics pick one of the best 5 albums of 1992. And then suddenly there was a feeding frenzy of record companies. We signed a bifurcated deal with Virgin in the whole world except for America and Canada. And then we signed a deal with Reprise in America and Canada. And so I was doing a lot of touring in Europe and the United States. And those records were critically acclaimed. And since mostly I'm a multi-instrumentalist, but mostly I focus on pedal steel guitar. And I kind of I've played plenty of country music, but I also like to dabble in other styles. And, I just ended up getting noticed by a bunch of other people. And suddenly I was getting session calls from, I think my first big Hollywood session call was Jellyfish. And, that led to, Chris Isaak, Black Crowes, Sheryl Crow, some international stuff. It led to a bunch of different places, which eventually got me working shoulder to shoulder as a musician with some really brilliant engineers and producers, guys like Chad Blake and Mitchell Froome and Mark Needham and Bob Clearmountain and, guys like that. So I was able to be a fly on the wall in those kinds of sessions. And that's, and then eventually I left American Music Club. Through a friend, I got signed to an independent deal with Hearts of Space Records, put out one record with them, which opened some new doors. And it was right about then that my wife and I purchased the home that we have now, which has a separate building on the property, which I converted into a recording studio. It's small, but it's super effective for me. And so I opened the room in 2000, and for the first probably 15 years of that, my typical MO working as a producer would be to start projects in a bigger studio locally where I, had a big console and ISOs and all sorts of room, work for, 2 days to a week and collect enough basic tracks to be able to come back to my studio for overdubs, editing, and mixing. And that's kind of where I've been, since 2000. Also doing some soundtracks when I get the opportunity to do that. That's really my favorite kind of work at this point, because it involves every bit of knowledge that I've ever gained along the way. It requires the engineering knowledge, music production, composition, music performance, and then the whole thing of, collaborating with other people. So
that's amazing.
That's where I'm at.
There's so much to unpack from that, and I feel like your life has been very cyclical in a lot of ways. Where you were a musician, got into the studio as doing work, and you're learning from some of these amazing producers who are in their own right, or just they've done some amazing things, and then from there you can turn all that into your own projects and implement a lot of that same stuff. It's quite amazing to hear. I'm curious to know, just like on the note of working with a lot of those bigger producers, like what are some of the bigger lessons that you learned being kind of a fly on the wall in those situations?
I would say that the number one lesson I learned was just work ethic, because I have never seen people work as hard as, like, for instance, I think Mark Needham, for me, who, if people aren't aware of him, he was Chris Isaak's engineer for a very long time, and he's done a ton of other stuff as well. Fleetwood Mac, and I think he did Etta James, or, he's just done a huge variety of stuff. And that man works himself to the bone. And, and that's the thing, is that it's an art and there's science to it, but it's also such a craft. And especially back in the analog days, you had to be, I'll just say working with Mark one time, I think maybe one specific window into how hard he would work. I came in to do an overdub one day, and he was working with an artist, a well-known artist who, is a really good singer. I mean, I've heard the guy sing live, and, amazing singer. And I think as I was about to leave, I asked Mark what he was going to be doing for the rest of the day, and he said, "Oh yeah, we're working on vocals. I think I'm up to like 125 takes and counting."
Wow.
in the vocal composite that he was making. And that was back in the day when, you had to bounce analog tracks to make a composite vocal. And, that requires a level of skill and precision and commitment that I don't think contemporary engineers can really understand, working in a non-destructive environment. I mean, believe me, I'm all for the democratization of recording tools, but I also feel so lucky to have been alive and working in the analog era, because I got to see a perspective that I don't think really exists in a certain sense at this point.
Yeah, that's interesting. It goes to show the level of passion and dedication people have as well, right? Like people who work that hard, it's not just because they like work. I mean, there are some people that are workaholics, but generally it's like, there's some element of gratification out of it. And, I think when you're working with an artist and you're sharing that creative vision, sometimes you just have to put in that time to get the results that you want, right?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the questions on your list of questions that I thought I would get into a little bit is, you asked something to the effect of, what technique or what do you do that some people might think is crazy?
Yeah.
and for instance, for me, if you're working in pop music, what's the most important track in a pop song? It's the lead vocal, hands down. There's nothing more important than that. And so when I'm leveling a lead vocal, I do it by hand, and I do it on a syllabic basis. I DS by hand. If a particular syllable needs to come up or down, I do it by hand, because that to me, and that, I have to say that actually comes from my exposure to Mark Needham again. Remembering watching him when he would do, when he was compositing a vocal, he would run it through a fader, and he would rehearse and then record moves, leveling moves on the fader before he would commit it to the composite, So, yeah. I mean, you can do that kind of stuff with automatic leveling devices. Just doesn't sound the same to me.
Well, there's something to like the hand touch, like,
yeah.
It's a feeling more than it is like an algorithm to some degree.
Totally. I mean, because machines, as intelligent as they're becoming, I don't know that the emotional content of the work that we do is really part of that package yet. It's funny because I just read an article this morning about engineers trying to engineer morality into self-driving cars, trying to choose which disaster is the least awful. It's like, do you choose the pregnant woman, or do you choose the 5 old people, to avoid crashing into, and, I just don't think that I've just never met a compressor that levels a vocal to my complete satisfaction. And that's not that I do use compression in recording vocals. I use it when I'm tracking, and I use it after I've done my hand leveling, but I don't use it in the same way that I would have used it in the analog era, because in the analog era, the reason for compression was signal to noise ratio, amongst other things. And we don't have that problem at this point, thank goodness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because it was more of like an automatic leveler to some degree,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I do want to touch on your session musician side of things. So, it sounded like you were playing as a musician in bands and stuff like that, and then you kind of fell into this world of being a session musician and recording in the studio, which I think is awesome. And you've definitely recorded a lot of great parts for some huge acts. So I'm curious to know a little bit more about, first off, how did you decide to become a pedal steel player? I feel like I don't know too many people that jump into that.
Yeah, well, I should go back and talk to myself in 1976. I was, there's like, I just read this morning that Eno says that, that he's not sure that he would have, chosen the life that he chose. I know that Bowie had the same thing. It's like, if he grew up now, would he have chosen to do what he did? Back in 1976, when I was starving, living in the basement that I was recording in, paying $75 a month rent and barely being able to make that a good day meant an egg in my top ramen, that kind of thing. I was trying to bootstrap myself as a musician, trying to, get a career going. And I was a guitar player at that point. And I was working in a music store, and one day a pedal steel came in. It was a terrible little student model pedal steel. And that was at a time when pedal steel was starting to make inroads into popular music, both Lloyd Green playing for Paul McCartney, Jerry Garcia playing for the New Riders, the Purple Sage, and Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young. And so I was starting to hear pedal steel. I wasn't a country music guy when I was a kid. But I was starting to hear it, and I thought it was a really cool instrument. I mean, it sounded really amazing. One came into the store. I decided to, the guys at the store were really nice. They let me take it home and mess with it for a while. I decided to buy it. I spent the next 6 months literally 7 days a week, probably 6 hours of practice time per day, because I thought, if I can just get myself up and running on this thing, then I can work more, right?
Interesting.
And so, and that turned out to be the truth. I practiced that way for 6 months, and then I gave up for a year because it sounded like a really bad cat fight. But I came back to it, and I started incorporating it into my nightclub gigging. I think the first song that I learned how to play was, I learned the horn arrangement for, that song, If You Leave Me Now. What was that? Chicago song, I think it might have been.
I think so.
Yeah. Da 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 da. Right. It's like the total 4/1 thing, which is what pedal steel is so great for. And, as it turned out, as I got to know the instrument better and as I got better and better gigs, I just really fell in love with the thing. It's a super interesting musical instrument. I kind of refer to it as the Baroque harmony generator, because the musical intelligence that is built into the functionality, and I mean that in the math kind of sense, the functionality that's built into the way that the pedals and knee levers alter the tuning, it just became really fascinating. And, I heard a lot of different ways that it could be used that I wasn't hearing it being used. And I've just been super fortunate to be able to mine some of those pathways with it, and been super fortunate to get some nice session calls to be able to do it for other people as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that you thought that by playing it, it would lead to more opportunities to work in the studio. So was that part of the intention of like choosing a bit of a different instrument rather than just being like, I'm a guitar player, this is my main thing? Like, was that kind of the goal there? Or was just like, if I niche down to this other instrument that not too many people play, like I'm the only guy in town or something like that?
Well, there weren't many guys in town. Really a small handful of guys playing that instrument. And where I grew up, surprisingly, because I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and which is not exactly known for country and Western music, but there was a really very active country and Western nightclub scene here. So I was able to kind of, do my 10,000 hours worth of perfecting my craft, or striving to perfect my craft, I should say, playing in that environment. And so it was the instrument presented opportunity in a number of ways. It presented opportunity to make sounds that I couldn't make on guitar. It represented opportunity to stand out more. That guy plays pedal steel, so, and he plays guitars. So I ended up doubling for a very long time. And it was actually a hand injury. I ended up developing carpal tunnel syndrome in my left hand to the extent where I have this beautiful 66 Telecaster, and I could not hold a bar chord down any longer because my hand was in such disrepair. That was a point at which I switched to becoming basically a full-time pedal steel player for at least a year for my hand to heal as much as it could, at least. So, it's opportunity, fate, random happenstance, geography. It's just all of that stuff built into one.
Yeah, it's interesting. So then you started playing and you got into the studio, and I imagine that once you're in that sphere of session musicians, I'm sure it's kind of a tight-knit community, it seems. And I'm curious to know, like, is that true? And also, like, for people who are maybe thinking of becoming session musicians themselves, like, how does one become a session musician? Was it just luck that you fell into it, or is there more of a process more people typically go through?
Well, I think ultimately, success as a musician, producer, engineer, any of the hats that I wear, you have to be able to get along with people, number one. You have to bring something that is unique. I just think that ultimately, I didn't really choose much. Most of it just kind of came my way. Being in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing. There are so many fabulous musicians out there in the world. I mean, I know so many who have just blown my mind, who don't end up finding themselves in a position of opportunity for whatever reason, I think it's kind of impossible to say. I think the main thing is networking, really. When it really comes down to it, if you want to try to get work, you have to be affable enough. I guess you either have to be so great that nobody cares if you're affable or not, or in my case, you have to be affable enough and do something that's relatively unique to be able to, work shoulder to shoulder with people. And, visibility, I have to say that at this point in time with, recording studios in every other garage at this point, I don't even know how to start with visibility for people. If you think about the history of recording back in the earlier days of it, you had to be a successful artist playing gigs for anybody to care enough about wanting to bring you into a recording studio and spend the money on producing you. So, whether it's like the, Alan Lomax out in the hills of Appalachia, sticking a microphone in front of, somebody who isn't a star, or, Frank Sinatra or whatever it is, it used to be a more rarefied atmosphere than it is now. I feel pretty bad for a lot of my clients these days because they work their asses off to try to get something, unique and of quality made, and then they go into the meat grinder of distribution, and it's like the 0.00001 cent worth of remuneration on Spotify, and it just, how do you make yourself known? And so, ultimately, I think a lot of good music goes by the wayside because it's just so terribly difficult these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that for sure. It's interesting you were talking about networking and kind of the idea of, the visibility. And I was curious to know how you like to keep, like, how do you manage to keep top of mind with musicians these days? Because I feel like, as a session musician, you're always trying to connect with as many people as you can, because the more people you connect with, the more opportunities could potentially come your way. But it's also, especially these days with COVID and everybody like kind of being indoors for the most part, like what are the ways that you try to keep in touch with people so that you can keep top of mind?
Well, if you asked me that question 5 years ago, the answer would have been extremely different than it is now. And that has to do with just, the random, grenades that life throws at you, right? My wife has had some pretty serious health issues in the last, since 2010, but she's, nearly died twice in the last 6 years. And I've had to spend a substantial amount of time being a caregiver in that period of time. So to be honest with you, for me personally right now, because my wife's health and well-being is top of mind more so than any other consideration, I have kind of been dialing back for the last number of years. And for me, what that means is that since I've kind of discovered over time that my favorite work is film scoring, and I am fortunate to every now and then get a good gig doing that. When my wife's health advances to the extent where I'm feeling a little bit, and when the pandemic cools down a little bit, I've got a couple of little projects I'm working on right now that I want to finish. But once I get to the end of that stuff, then I intend to try to market myself more aggressively with filmmakers. That's kind of the direction that I'm going. As far as like being the cool dude, engineer, producer guy for various bands during the pandemic, I've done a couple of projects during the pandemic that I am pretty wild about, that I was really thrilled with. But one of the reasons I was really thrilled with is it gave me more of an opportunity to be a player. Rather than just being the engineer producer guy. I've done so much engineering and producing at this point that I've kind of come full circle yet again to what is it that really turns me on. And what really, really, really turns me on is writing and playing. Producing and engineering turns me on too, but it's much more involved, and it's essentially impossible right now. I've got a couple of albums that have been in hiatus during the pandemic because we were in middle of tracking, and nobody wants to spend time in the studio together. And the albums I finished, I was able to finish because I was working with clients who trusted me to kind of just take care of all the loose ends, right? We had vocals in the can, or it was remote file sharing and that kind of thing. And so I think once the pandemic is past, assuming that we are ever past it, which I hope we are, maybe I'll change my mind again. But at least for the moment, film work is the thing that's turning me on.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, it's great to hear that you're kind of niching down and that you found the thing that you're most passionate about and going all in on that. And I'm curious to know, like a lot of people do tend to niche down the work or the genres of music that they work in. And I'm curious to know, do you recommend that as a session musician, or is it generally better to just take on as many genres as possible and try to be the jack of all trades kind of thing?
Wow, that's a good question. Frankly, like I said, I've known some incredible musicians over the course of my life, and I just don't know anyone who is equally good at everything. I don't expect, rock musicians to be able to do a jazz session, or, a guitar player to be able to fit in with a classical Indian, ensemble or anything like that. So I would say that, the kind of musician, the kind of musician that I'm most attracted to at this point, it would be someone who's capable of reading and doing a great job of interpreting notation, but at the same time plays with a heart full of emotion. And for instance, in this crazy world we live in, there's a violinist that I became aware of through working on a project with a dear old friend of mine. This woman runs a company called Mini Orchestra. She's Russian. She's in Russia. And she and a cellist friend can create a string section, of however many pieces you want. And her rates are affordable enough that, she's a go-to for me at this point, because I can hand her a chart, or I can send her a MIDI file. And I, can give her instructions as to what I'm looking for. And it almost always comes back exceeding my expectations. So, there's that kind of thing. And then I had another experience recently where a guy I think is going to drop off of my list I was working on a film cue, and I gave him very specific instructions to record something at home. And he came back and gave me the exact opposite of what I asked for, and then was inflexible about doing a second take. Those are the kind of guys that I'm not going to rehire. Right? So, it comes back to what I was saying earlier, being affable, being capable, and realizing that, collaborative work requires compromise. I don't want to be that guy in the studio that puts down someone else's idea without giving it due diligence. It's like, so if somebody is able to express what they want to hear, and it's within my power to give that to them, then far be it from me to not. And a lot of times you can learn in that process, right? It's like, oh, I wouldn't have thought to do that. Oh, well, maybe next time I should think to try that, Yeah. So being flexible and cooperative and a good team player, that's the way to get work as a session musician. And of course you got to be able to play and
of course
and emote and be a good hang,
Yeah. I love that you kind of showed both sides of the coin there, where it's like, the person that you would ultimately hire versus the person who you don't want to work with. And I think it's important to hear hear both sides of that, because then it allows people to realize oh yeah, maybe I am kind of being a jerk about the way I approach my projects, or, maybe I do need to be a little bit more forgiving and flexible with all that. Because I do think that what you said there makes so much sense. It's you have to just be a collaborative person. And if you're not, then...
To me, I have to say that in my work as a producer, engineer, and session player, you could put this on my epitaph, which is just, there's no higher experience than friendly, creative collaboration. I just love getting in with it with people and finding out, when I'm working as a film scorer, my favorite part of that process is the conversations that I have with the director to find out, okay, so I see the film that I'm going to be working with. I understand on a surface level what it is that you're saying, but what are you really saying underneath? Where are you trying to guide the audience? And that to me that's the nut. That's the part that is the part that I want to be involved in, is because, especially with the amount of division, political division, especially, that exists in the world we're in right now, being able to cooperate and collaborate and produce something positive it's life affirming, in the face of so much negativity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love what you said there about asking the director like where they want to go with that, because that is ultimately what a film score should do. It's not just about adding music to picture. It's making people feel something and steering them in that direction. So
how I describe it as music is the emotional rudder of a film.
It's true. It's absolutely true.
Yeah.
It's funny. I was working at a post-production facility many years ago, and I remember when that movie No Country for Old Men came out, and that movie had no audio or no music at all. And I remember like the owner of the studio freaking out about it. He was like, "What's happening here? Like, like we need to make like this movie relies so heavily on the sound effects and all that stuff and the dialogue, but it's a major chunk of the movie missing by not having any audio."
Right. Oh, what a scary movie that was. Oh.
But yeah, I mean, it's refreshing to hear your approach to it, because it's not just there are some people that think that it is just making music to match up the picture and to go with like the cuts and all that. But I think by creating that emotional response in the music, it really does take someone to a new level with the picture.
Yeah, I certainly think so.
Yeah. You had mentioned earlier the idea of reading music as well. And I'm curious to know, is it necessary to be able to read music as a session musician?
No.
Okay.
Obviously some of the greatest music in the world has been made by people who do not work with notation. Paul McCartney is a great example. John Lee Hooker, a guy that I was able to work with early on in my career, he was illiterate, period. I mean, he could not read or write English, let alone music, right? So it's one of those things. Music knowledge is a kind of a funny idea, right? Because I think where music comes from, and because my wife has suffered from brain aneurysms, I've kind of had to learn a lot about the way the brain works. And, there's the left hemisphere, which is more analytical, and the right hemisphere, which is, out of linear time and is considered to be the more creative side of ourselves. The way that music works for me, at least, is because I'm not a gifted sight reader. I never have been. It's just been one of those stumbling blocks for me. It just never connected with sight reading. I'm literate. I understand music notation. I can write music using notation, and I can deliver charts and that kind of thing. And, so it's all good in that regard. But the way that I look at, notation and or theory, harmony, counterpoint, all of the stuff that can be studied in school, all that stuff is after the fact. The music comes from a non-temporal, creative place. And I know that, or I should say that I have very strong suspicions that Johann Sebastian Bach and Beethoven and those dudes, they didn't write the rules first. They made the music, and then everybody has made the rules based on what they did, right? They heard what sounded good to them. They were able to communicate it. So I find that stuff like notation and music theory and all that stuff, it's super useful for communicating between musicians and production people. But it's not where the music comes from. So you don't need, if you're a great player, soulful player who brings the goods every time you sit down and do what you do, you're going to work, right? If all you can do is read, then you might still work too, but it would be more like in a symphony setting, or like a pickup, a contract band for when Julio Iglesias comes to town or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Where you're just, there's a chart, you read the chart, you go home. So yeah.
Yeah. But even still, I mean, you're right. If you are reading, you still need to put in the emotion and the feel to it as well. It can't just be like a static thing, and
no.
Otherwise it sounds mechanical.
Exactly. I mean, the computers do that really well.
Yeah, we don't need musicians for that.
Yeah.
We just need someone to like type it in with a keyboard, MIDI keyboard, and then we're done, right?
Exactly. Quantize it, and it's all good.
Yeah. As a session musician, I'm curious to get your thoughts on, with these days, especially again with COVID and all this stuff, do you think that it's important for session musicians to have their own home studios?
I just don't know how a contemporary musician can survive, especially with the pandemic. Maybe that's changing now, but at least over the last, over the first 15 months of the pandemic, my studio was not open, to outside players coming in. And if I wanted to work with someone, they had to be able to record themselves at home. I actually helped a couple musicians that I know get up and running to the best of their ability with home studios where they hadn't done that before, simply because I wanted to be able to use them on a track, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think being computer literate in this day and age for music production, I just don't see how you get around it. Again, I suppose like if you're a Zakir Hussain or someone who is just so head and shoulders notably above all of the rest, who can just depend on, someone else to do the tedious parts of it for them, more power to them. But how many guys are there that are like that?
It's true. Yeah, I kind of think of it like an extension of your instrument in a way, where it's like you have to be able to not only play your music and have good equipment and blah, 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 but like to be able to actually perform it and record it is now, especially as a session musician, it's like, it's that extra thing that makes you attractive to other musicians. It's like if you can record yourself and you can do a good job of it, then, it saves having to pay someone at a big studio and hope that you can get in there and, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just, it's just part of the language at this point, really,
And I also think maybe it's just a selfish thing, but I think it's a lot of fun to be able to record your own instrument and feel good at it,
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can't tell you how frustrating it is for me when I try to always negotiate when I'm doing session playing at this point that I can do it at home, because my process, if I was engineering me, I would drive myself crazy. You know what I'm saying? But as a musician engineering myself, I've just developed a process where I don't care if it takes me 40 takes to do a phrase the way that I want to hear it, because I know what it is in my head. I'm thinking of this one producer engineer guy that I have done sessions for, who would not allow me to develop my ideas. And with pedal steel, it's like, it's a non-fixed pitch instrument. So tuning is just another one of those things that there's tone production, there's, choosing the right way to articulate something. There's all of these different parameters that have to be firing on all cylinders at the same time for me to be happy with the work that I'm doing. And I remember I recorded something and it was out of tune, and I heard it back and I said, "Oh, that's out of tune. We got to fix that." He said, "No, I love it that way." And it's like, so yeah, I adore recording myself. And plus also I've figured out how to make my instrument sound the way I want to hear it. Right. And that means that my mic collection and my preamp collection and my compression collection, all that stuff, it's very carefully curated after, literally decades of searching for the sound that I want to hear. Right. So, you can't just walk into a studio and say, "Hey, engineer dude, I'm going to tell you how to do your job. Use this mic and that preamp." And, some people afford that possibility, like if they recognize that you've spent a lot of time working on that part of your skill. But, then for other people, it actually ends up being, kind of a way to get on their wrong side. It's like, you know what I'm saying? I'm thinking of when I was on tour one time with American Music Club, we were carrying our own monitor system for our singer. And I remember this one club that we played at where the house engineer was so affronted by the fact that we were carrying our own monitors and that I had the audacity to be setting that up on his stage. I mean, give me a break.
Yeah. I mean, you know your instrument best, and that's just, that's ultimately going to get you a better sound. It kind of reminds me of like years ago, I was on tour with Kiss, and this band that I was tour managing, the guitar player, they had been signed by Gene, so they had a close relationship with him. But the guitar player, he liked to play his guitar pretty high up on his body, and every night
that's a quick route to huge prejudice. I also play my guitar very high up. So
okay. Yeah. So every night before we would hit the stage, Gene would walk by the dressing room and be like, "Steve, you got to put it down by your waist. That's rock and roll. You can't do it." And he bugged him for we were on tour with him for like 3.5 months, and like finally like 3 months in, the guitar player was like, "You know what? I'll do it just to please you for one night." And he did it, and it was the worst set of the whole tour because he wasn't used to playing it that way. Yeah. It was like it was an uncomfortable thing for him. And
it's also a great way to injure yourself.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I remember afterwards he was like, "Gene, I'm never listening to you again. Like that was horrible." so yeah, I mean, it goes to show like when you know your instrument and you know what makes it sound good and the equipment that makes it sound good, like, why not use it the way you love it, right?
That's, I mean, again, it just depends on what the situation is and what the people you're working with are trying to get. If they want to get your best, then there has to be some give and take. And again, that turns around and that relates to something I said earlier, which is as an engineer producer, you have to be open to listening to and compromising with the people you're working with. If you want to get the best out of them, it's like if you the quickest way for me to give you something that's not good is if you shut part of me down.
Yeah. And I do think that it depends on whose project it is as well. And, establishing whose creative vision is the one that we're all trying to accomplish here. And depending on how they feel about it, obviously, like, then what you can and can't get away with. Because sometimes, as much as the producer wants to be the person that's overseeing everything, sometimes it's just like, the lead songwriter of the band is the one that's paying the bills and it's like going to be their rules, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
You do have to establish kind of who the leader of these sessions are so you can get all on the same page and ultimately work together to make that person's vision come to life, right?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it ends up being the last hands that touches it, right? I mean, the mixer is the one who ends up with, I mean, obviously it's the client who's paying the bills, who is the last voice to be heard. But, someone, like, one of the things that I'll tell people that I'm working with, when I'm trying to get them to do something that doesn't feel innate to them, is I'll just say, look, I sent you these tracks a few days ago. You've probably listened to them for maybe an hour or two. And I've been working on this for months. I've heard this track probably 300 times. I know what it needs on a molecular level. This is what it needs. Please give me that. Right. And if they can do it, great. If they can't do it, then I'll try to edit my way through what they give me after the fact. And if the editing doesn't work, then I'll get somebody else to do what they were doing. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of recording your own instrument, I'd love to talk about recording pedal steel, because it's not something that I feel a lot of people get the opportunity to record. So I'd love to talk about, what is the best way to record a pedal steel?
Well, that would depend on who you ask, of course. For me personally, I just, growing up when I grew up and having had the analog experience all along the way, I still haven't heard modeling that matches up to me to an amplifier and a speaker and air and a microphone and a preamp and a compressor and, into the DAW. So what I do, I have a very, very expensive volume pedal. Volume pedal, the way that a pedal steel works is it's like a table, right? With strings stretched over it. There's a bridge, just like a guitar has a bridge. It's a fancy electric guitar is what it is, but it's mounted on a table. The bridge has what are called fingers that the string comes over the top of. And those fingers are on an axle, and they're connected to pedals and knee levers that either stretch or relax one or more strings anywhere from a half step to a step and a half or thereabouts. And so the tuning is the open tuning is what changes by virtue of those pedals and knee levers. So when you're playing pedal steel, your left hand is holding the bar. Your right hand usually has picks on it, and you're plucking the strings. Your left knee is between knee levers. Your right knee is between knee levers. Your left foot is playing an assortment of these pedals that change the pitches. And then your right foot is hovered over a volume pedal.
It's a full body workout.
It's a very strange thing. There's a lot of muscle memory going on there. The volume pedal that I've got is made by a company called Telonics. And the pedal has one input, two outputs that are in parallel and buffered, and one other output, which is for a tuner, which is also buffered. I also have a second one where they designed it where it has a VCA output as well. What I do, because I can only do one thing well at a time, and sometimes barely that. And when I'm playing pedal steel, my engineering skill just evaporates. I can't watch levels and play at the same time. So I've learned over time that I need to give myself a safety valve there, which is, so one of my outputs goes to an Evil Twin direct box. And that is set up so that I know that I've got a clean signal if I have to go back and reamp. The other leg output goes to a preamp, which feeds a power amp, and I have a feed through in my control room to my studio. I feed the amplifier output so as to not lose any high frequency through capacitance. Out into the other room, I have a speaker out there. I use, I've come to find over the years that my favorite mic for recording pedal steel is a Sony C37A, which is a vintage tube mic, large capsule condenser. I feed that into a DW Fern VT2. That goes into a Pendulum OCL2 opto compressor, and that goes straight to Pro Tools. And then in Pro Tools, I always set up both a delay and a reverb, and I use those in very ample amounts in monitoring what I'm doing, because I find that, and I have always found that playing less is more, and having sounds that are able to develop over time encourages me to play less. And so then when I'm done, it's like, say, for instance, I'm doing a remote track for somebody, then I'll go through and I'll composite my pedal steel track, which is a simple, it's the DI plus the amp track, which are coupled. I'll edit my way through that, crossfade that, and then print a final processing that I usually send off, depending on how much I trust or distrust the engineering on the other side of that. I'll either send off a composite dry plus wet signal, or I'll send the dry signal plus a wet signal and just kind of instruct the engineer, the wet, if you put these two stems, at unity gain, you'll get what I was hearing, and you can start there, or you can tear it apart and do what you want with it. And I've had people use just the the stereo effects return, just the dry stuff. It just depends on the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like a pretty hefty chain you got there, but obviously, yeah, you've worked on it over, like you said, decades, and you've dialed it into a point where you know what to expect from it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And as far as the amp that you would go out to, what kind of amps do you typically use for those?
Well, these days my chain seems to be a Brad Sarno Tube Revelation preamp. Brad Sarno is a guy that I first met many years ago at a pedal steel convention. He's kind of like a pedal steel electronics guru. And his preamp is really gorgeous. I mean, it's really well thought out. There's an effects loop in it. There's the instrument in and then a send return prior to the preamp so that your volume pedal can go in at a good spot. It's parametric middle frequency section. It's just got it's all tube. It's just a great sounding box. That I run into an Evans solid state power amplifier because I find that the combination of tube front end and solid state back end for pedal steel is very effective because pedal steel, if you're going to distort it, you have to be pretty intentional about it. Easy for me to say. Because one of the things that's really interesting, guitar players might relate to it. Like if you're playing very high and you play two notes at the same time, a dyad, if you're playing with a lot of distortion, you end up getting something called a difference tone, which is, it becomes very obvious on pedal steel because if you're on pedal steel, you're able to bend notes in the opposite direction at the same time. So like if I had an E and a B playing at the same time, I can raise the E to F sharp and lower the B to A, for instance, without moving the bar, right? And so you get this kind of like zippering effect. And when you do that at a high up on the neck, you'll get this tone that appears where the minute that the tuning, like how you can use beating to recognize when two notes aren't in tune with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The difference tone is kind of like that. I mean, case in better point, let's say that I was playing a unison high up on the neck with two notes, high in frequency, where I then make one go up and one go down. If you just slightly detune them, then you're going to get beating. That beating literally starts at one cycle. And then it's, the farther you get, that frequency increases on the bottom end. So as you detune the two notes, you get this boom, you get this huge bottom note out of them. And so if you have distortion on a pedal steel, it can become a pretty significant, ugly problem. So having a high-powered amplifier is a way of ensuring that you don't have that kind of distortion. Now, it's also fun to play with that if you are intentionally distorting. For that, I have a Bogner Uberschall head that I'll plug into, or a Fender Deluxe that's been modified, or a Brad Sarno Earth Drive, which is a pedal that minimizes that difference tone problem. So that's my amplification system. I have a couple of cabinets that I built myself, and they're open back 15-inch JBLs or Eminence, either way. And again, it's all just time tested stuff.
That's cool. Yeah, I've always been amazed by I love the sound of pedal steel, and I think that it can create some like really cool ambient sonic textures, and I love that. And I've only had the pleasure of recording it once, and I remember just being like in a trance recording it. You know, it was like such a cool experience. And I was wondering, what are some of your favorite signal chains for creating those lush tones? Is it just simply reverb and delay?
To a very great extent. You know, at one point I actually had a MIDI pickup on my pedal steel. And so I would generate, synth or sampled stuff simultaneously. You can do that with a keyboard, after the fact. So I kind of stopped using that because carting around that much gear was just ridiculous. I mean, I was able to do it while touring, but playing gigs around town and that kind of thing, it's too much hassle. So, again, I grew up in an era when the digital delay and digital reverb was invented. I'm an old guy, and Lexicon has always been a sound that I've just adored. I mean, and I'm very pleased that Lexicon has what they call the PCM total bundle for use with a digital audio workstation. I just love the way that sounds. I use Valhalla reverbs every now and then, Altiverb, various different things at different times. But I'd say that my go-to is definitely still Lexicon. It's just this miraculous sound as far as my ear is concerned. And then I use Soundtoys Echo Boy is my favorite delay at this point. I just love how versatile and controllable it is. And then I'll feed delay into reverb and, this and that. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much where that kind of ambient signal path comes from.
That's awesome. Yeah, and everything I've heard of yours, you have a great tone, and obviously, yeah, you've definitely refined that and made it into something that just sounds nice and polished and gives you that space that I think pedal steel is. I think that's what people want. They want that ambient sounds, right?
Well, many people do. Yeah, certainly. I think I don't know. I've never been tempted to move to Nashville, because I just don't think that. What I do would necessarily fit in there all that well. I don't really like playing that kind of sort of utterly predictable stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not putting down what they do there. There's a very, very super high level of proficiency and creativity and skill there. It's just, I like the periphery of musical style more personally.
Fair. Absolutely. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so we should probably start to wrap up here. But if people want to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I have a website. It's just www.brucekaphan.com. That's Kaphan. And, I don't tend to maintain the website all that terribly well, but it has a good historical, presentation of like my discography is there, which sad to say that the idea of a discography in a streaming age starts to become something kind of difficult to try to figure out how to maintain, because, when something comes out and there's no graphics involved with it and there's no physical release or any such thing, it's hard to figure out exactly how to post it. But a lot of my history is up there in the discography, and then my albums are up there. And there's a couple other projects that I did recently that I'm very proud of and that I would recommend people go see. On Bandcamp, you can find both of them on Bandcamp. One is a guy named Jerry Vessel, Vessel. His closest claim to notoriety has been as bass player of Red House Painters. We just did an album during the pandemic finished it during the pandemic. We started before the pandemic and finished during, that I think is really remarkable. It's one of the most deeply emotional albums I've ever worked on. And then I've done a ton of records with Victor Krummenacher, that's Krummenacher, who is most notoriety has come with Camper Van Beethoven and Cracker as their bass player. But Victor and I have done, I can't even count how many records we've done together. And his most recent one, Silver Smoke of Dreams, is up on Bandcamp as well. And it was also one that was done in the pandemic. And it was a really remarkable experience in terms of the whole, remote sharing thing. Tracks came in from his drummer in Los Angeles, that, he had no experience recording himself. So I think he might have been recording with the onboard mic on his laptop into GarageBand. And, so there's the whole thing of getting these really disparate tracks to work together. That was super challenging, but also really rewarding.
Yeah, sometimes you can get some crazy sounds by attempting weird techniques like that.
Yeah,
whether they're intentional or not, right?
Yeah, I ended up learning a ton about. I've been using it for a long time, but Stephen Slate's Trigger was remarkable, a remarkable, powerful tool in, extrapolating stereo tracks, right?
Yeah.
In order to be able to trigger other sounds. So that was cool.
That's definitely awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, looking forward to checking out those tracks that you suggested there. And Bruce, thank you so much for taking the time to be on here. I think you give tons of great information about, being in that session musician world. And I think that's something a lot of people aspire to get into, but maybe they don't have any idea of what's involved or how to get into it, right?
Well, best of luck to anyone who wants to try. It's, again, when I came up, it was a different environment because of major label work was still something that actually happened then. The landscape these days is nothing but confusing to me. So I think the definition of session musician at this point is probably closer to what you were describing at one point in the conversation, which is just, being able to record yourself at home and being of use to other people. And
it's true.
Being able to do that, it's worth the effort to learn the tools and, purchase the tools to be able to do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great spot to stop. So, once again, Bruce, thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Appreciate
nice
it.
to meet you.
So that was my interview with Bruce Kaphan, and that was a great interview. I love the stories that he shared, especially about working with Mark Needham and his work ethic that he had. And I also love Bruce just being honest about what the current state of being a session musician is and what that looks like these days versus, maybe 10 years ago or so. I think it really shed some light on what you should do if you yourself are trying to become a session musician and how to best prepare yourself so that you can get those gigs, whether it's recording on your own or recording at a studio or reading other people's music and all that stuff. I think Bruce just touched on so many great topics here. So if you're considering becoming a session musician and you're curious to know, what should you be doing, definitely revisit this episode because there was a ton of great stuff in here. So I hope that you enjoyed that episode, and if you did, definitely make sure to subscribe to this podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live. And also make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com. That is where I help out musicians with their home studios, and I help them create pro-sounding recordings from their home studios, making the process of recording, editing, and mixing your music very easy. My goal here is to help you feel proud of the music that you're writing and feel excited to share it with the world. So I want to help you make the process of mixing easy and feel confident in the process. process. So definitely make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com, because on that website, I've got tons of great resources designed to do just that. One thing that you're going to want to check out while you're there is The Mixing Mindset. This is a book that I put out a few years ago that became an Amazon #1 bestseller. And inside of that book, I really break down the process step by step for mixing your records from beginning to end so that you know exactly what to do at all stages and when you're done, because that is also a very important thing as well. You need to know when you're done your mixes so that you can actually put this music out there. Because if you just feel stuck in that trap of not knowing whether you're done or whether you should be doing more to your project, you'll never release it. So inside of that book, I really make it very clear what the process is that you should follow so you can feel confident with your music and ultimately put it out. So once again, that book is available at MasterYourMix.com, and it's called The Mixing Mindset. So with that said, that is it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed that, and I look forward to chatting with you in the next one. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.